All right, y'all. I'm start today with um, George Washington, our first president, and I think I sent you the email. Apologize for um, being a while. Um, I kind of decided to give y'all a little break, and then some of those personal things occurred and got me away from paying attention to things I needed to pay attention to. But sometimes those things happen. But anyway, it's time to move forward. And of course, I'm going to talk about the first president of the United States, at least in this Constitution, um, George Washington. And George Washington's first term was from 1789 to 1793, and we'll talk a little bit about his first term in this lecture. Some people wanted the presidency to be more like almost kind of like a monarch with pomp and circumstances. Other people wanted to be kind of very, very humble. Um, Washington did a little bit of both. He obliged some Americans for the desire for pomp and circumstances. He rode in really nice, elegant coaches, gave formal dinner parties, wore black velvet clothes, a powdered wig, yellow gloves, carried a polished sword. When visiting Boston, he refused to call upon the governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, because he said that the governor should call upon him. But those who feared monarchy successfully opposed the proposal to stamp coins with the head of the president, which was and substituted for the goddess of liberty instead. So there was this fear of kind of going, making the president too much like a king. One of the things that he did, or actually what Congress did in 1789, was pass the Judiciary Act, which set up our judicial branch. Now, in terms of Washington's cabinet, he appointed a kind of a balanced cabinet, you might say, because there was not yet political parties. Okay, there were no political parties when Washington took over, but there certainly was an ideological divide. On one side, you could say was Hamilton. On the other side, you might say was Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. So Uh, you say later on, Thomas Jefferson would be called a Democratic Republican, and Alexander Hamilton would be called a Federalist. Now, what was George Washington? He was neither, although he was probably ideologically more on the side of the Federalists. And some books you will see the party affiliations of each president, and you will notice in some books they'll have party where it has a party affiliation. See this on the internet as well. Washington, there will be nothing. Other places they'll have Federalists because ideologically he belonged more on that side. And we could kind of talk a little bit about um, their ideas, I guess. The Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And we're not going to get too much into it. We may get into it more later if we have time. The Democratic Republicans were more for small government, more for state rights. They were what we call strict constructionist, which means they believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The Federalists believed in a strong central government. They believed in big business with maybe less, I'm not going to say less regulation, but they believed in a government that would help the commercial class. international trade, big business, things like that. Um, Somebody like Alexander Hamilton, for example, believed that in order to get the ship of state, to get it to, out to sea, you needed the support of big business. And they believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, so there were other things. That just kind of gives you an idea. And of course, Jefferson and Hamilton were, you might say, kind of the ideological um, fathers of those two political parties, if you want to say. Now, so we were talking about Washington's cabinet, and he appointed Alexander Hamilton to the Secretary of the Treasury. No problem with my pen there. Thomas Jefferson um, was appointed as Secretary of of State. Guy by the name of Henry Knox. That's my first name, by the way, even though my mama always called me Lane. Everybody always called me Lane, but that's actually my first name. People pick at me about that for some reason, but anyway, I don't mind Henry. Secretary of War. They call it Secretary of Defense today, but back then they were less politically correct, I guess, and just called it like it was. Um, that was, I guess, really the three cabinet members that I want you to remember. There were others, for example, like Edmund Randolph, who was the Attorney General. I guess I can mention him. Attorney General. And it was Washington who set the precedent of independent executive set the precedent of independent executive negotiation of treaties. The Constitution stated vaguely that the president should negotiate treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. But when an Indian tribe in 1790, but when Washington asked for Senate advice for regarding his first treaty with an Indian tribe in 1790, the Senate claimed ignorance of the subject and promised to form a committee to investigate the matter, and Washington, being impatient, flew into a rage and stalked out of the Senate chamber. And from then on, presidents have negotiated treaties independently, though keeping an ear to the Senate to avoid embarrassing rejection, because it's the Senate that has to, ultimately approve of treaties and things like that. All right, so a little sip of water here. Now, we're going to kind of end this lecture. This is going to take about 5-10 minutes here. But we're going to talk about Hamilton's. Remember, Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary, and Hamilton's fiscal program. If you want to talk about your fiscal situation, you're talking about your money and your budget and all of that. One of the things that Hamilton wanted to do, he wanted the federal government to assume state debts. And what this meant is that the federal government would take on the debt of the states. Now, some of the states got into very high debt dealing with other countries, and Hamilton felt that it was very important that the United States if they were to be taken seriously by other countries, that they paid off their debts. And so this caused some problems, obviously, in places like Virginia, who didn't really have debt. What you have to realize, if there's another state that has debt, say New York, at this time, and the federal government takes on state debts, basically that means that everybody's kind of using their money to take care of the debt of certain states, even if your state, like Virginia, for example, was not in debt. And so they were basically, so that caused some problems. Um, Eventually, Hamilton was forced to kind of compromise, but it did pass both the House and the Senate. And this is probably overall, I think, a good idea that they did this. But it did kind of, that's when you start seeing the rise of political parties, which actually Washington didn't like. And in my opinion, he was right. I think that um, the way people are Democrats and Republicans, they don't really think about issues individually, unfortunately, and these ideas just kind of become a religion in a way. Now, something else that was part of Hamilton's fiscal program was the excise tax on, basically a sales tax on whiskey. A lot of people, if you have the coast is here, here's Florida, um, and so you had the Appalachian Mountains here, and there were farmers in the mountains and that kind of thing that had trouble getting corn to the East Coast to sell. Um, so they sold whiskey. The reason they had trouble, but the corn would be bad by the time they got through the mountains and all of that. But whiskey sometimes, gets better with age, and so it would keep. So that was a lot of farmers made whiskey, and that's how they made money. And Hamilton's proposed an excise tax on distilled liquor. Now, Hamilton's purpose was to have Congress exercise its new constitutional power to tax. Again, this was a Federalist, what became, the Federalist Party that wanted a strong central government and strong authority by the government. Okay. It did not really bother Hamilton that the people who would suffer most from the whiskey tax were frontier farmers. Um, the excise tax encountered little resistance in Congress since the assumption and funding plan had created an enormous federal debt which could only be paid, for through taxes. This would later cause a rebellion, by the way, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Something else was the National Bank. The National Bank kind of served something similar to what the Federal Reserve Board does today in terms of printing currency and that kind of thing. It was very interesting. Um, and it was the National Bank that really probably produced the most party sentiment. Um, Hamilton argued that a national bank was needed to protect federal funds, to regulate the money supply, to encourage entrepreneurs by providing low interest loans. Under Hamilton's plan, although 80% of the bank's stock would be privately owned, the federal government would exert control over the bank's policies. And private stockholders in the bank could buy 3/4 of their stock with government bonds. This is a clever way of retiring much of the national debt without paying a penny. Whatever one thinks of Hamilton's proposal of a national bank, uh, the specifics of his plan, Hamilton was no dummy. Okay, let me just put it this way. I mean, if the guy took the ACT test, he'd have scored very high. And there's some people that still think that this is like really unconstitutional. Jefferson thought this was unconstitutional at the time. There are people that think the Federal Reserve Board right now is unconstitutional. These are strict constructionists. Okay, and again, you don't have to remember the details of all this. It's kind of giving you the gist of it, and also your textbook actually does a pretty good job in explaining some of these things. Washington wasn't sure whether to sign this or not, but he took the advice of his cabinet, and he took the advice of since Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary, he listened to Hamilton, and therefore went ahead with what Hamilton wanted. Probably the only part of Hamilton's fiscal program that was what's this look like? That was not to which failed to win congressional approval was his proposal of an extensive set of measures to aid infant American industries, including subsidies, federally funded internal improvements, and most importantly, protective tariffs. Now, what is a protective tariff? I'm sure you know this already. If a good from another country comes in and they want to sell it in the United States, they have to pay a tax. And if the tax is high enough, it's, of course, all taxes are just going to be transferred to the consumer. People are going to stop buying that good in order, and this protects U.S. made goods. Now, it sounds like a good idea, but maybe to some extent it can be at times. It depends on the situation. All right, it's not always good and always bad. Like some people like to make out certain, a lot of issues. Okay, um, it can, like, there's an example of the Chinese crawfish that are, in Louisiana we had to deal with for a while. And we did place a protective tariff on the Chinese crawfish, and it helped our crawfish farmers. A lot of times when you place tariffs on goods coming in, then those countries, let's say if it's coming from Europe, they're not going to make as much money, which means they're not going to buy products from us, or they may retaliate with their own protective tariff. So you have to be very, very careful with this type of thing. But anyway, Congress did pass a few meager tariffs in 1792, but nothing like what Hamilton wanted. Okay, and that basically kind of sums up a big part of Hamilton's first term. And it was Washington's first term. Hamilton could never be president because he was not born in the United States. And the next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about Washington's second term. But I kind of want you to understand that it was Hamilton's fiscal program that helped create the different political parties. Okay, and like I said, I'm going to give you. Y'all be patient. This week I will give you really probably your next 2 or 3 assignments, and maybe even an extra point. Just kind of so you know where you're going. Okay, all right.